Hello class, sorry I couldn't be there today. Wanted to make sure though that I gave you an opportunity to get started on your next assignment, which is your Lincoln Assassination tweets. Just so you know, this will be the second to last PowerPoint that you'll be doing this school year, and as you're beginning this Unit 14, it's obviously nice that we're starting to round out the school year here. So read your directions with you, and then I'm going to get into your PowerPoint, which should help you do this. Lincoln Assassination tweets. Your job is to pretend that you're a journalist who needs to inform the public about Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Instead of reporting in an 1860s newspaper, you'll instead be composing a total of 5 tweets, 5 short little messages that cover Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Each tweet should be less than or equal to 140 characters, just as it is on Twitter. To check if your tweets meet these qualifications, you can use the website www.lettercount.com. This is great. You can just type in what you think you want for your tweet, and it will tell you exactly how many characters. And as long as you're under or equal to 140, you are fine. You need to pretend your intended audience has no prior knowledge of the events leading to and after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. This assignment is going to be worth 10 points. It is due tomorrow. You'll be graded on if you have 5 tweets that are 140 characters or less and the accuracy of the information that you present. Your tweets should cover different aspects of the time period surrounding Lincoln's death, since I'm going to give you a giant snapshot of kind of what happens in regards to this historical event. Feel free to link names at Abe Lincoln, at Honest Abe, at John W. Booth, etc. Be creative with this. Obviously, none of these historical people have their own Twitter account, but if you want to make up a few that make logical sense, then feel free to do that. Also, if you'd like to use hashtags, that's kind of a neat idea as well. I put for a couple examples for you here: Lincoln dead, or POTUS, which stands for President of the United States, POTUS shot, etc. So you can kind of have some fun with this. Put your own social media flair in there with these tweets. You're going to use the Lincoln Assassination PowerPoint that I'm going to be going over with you here in just a few moments to help you with this assignment. How you'll fill this out: please put your name and your hour on the sheet of paper that I'm providing you, and then put out your Twitter username. This doesn't have to be your actual Twitter username, but just, whatever you think, if you were a reporter, you would want your Twitter handle to be. For each of your tweets, you'll see I have a little box like this along with date and time of the tweet. You are putting this into historical terms, so obviously you're going to want to start tweeting as soon after Lincoln is shot as possible, or maybe even the moments before. So you'll want to make sure you're looking at the dates that I have that are associated with this PowerPoint. And the time as well. So maybe are you tweeting at 8:59 a.m.? Are you tweeting at 11:35 p.m.? As long as you're in the neighborhood of when these events happen, and as long as you have them in chronological order, you should be fine. And then these little blanks here that say what's happening, this is for you to compose your tweet. Now, if you have one that's a couple lines long, you'll just need to make sure that you leave enough room in these spaces to do that. And then you can see I have that for your second, third, fourth, and fifth tweets right there. Now on to the PowerPoint that you will be doing, and I have also attached this on Google Classroom so you can take a look at it. This is 51 slides long, so that's why I attached it, so not only as you're following along with me, you can have an idea what's going on, but if you need to go back or if you need to highlight some information as a news reporter, those are the types of things that you should be doing. So without further ado, here goes our PowerPoint. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln. After the war was over, and I learned this just a few years ago actually, Lincoln actually had a dream where he heard people crying in the White House, and he actually dreamed that he would die from an assassination attempt, according to historians. So a lot of people who studied Lincoln found out that he told people about this dream in his time as president, and his dream actually came to fruition, which is pretty scary. I guess I'll introduce you first to Lincoln's assassin. His name is John Wilkes Booth, born on May 10th, 1838 in Maryland. This isn't anything that you need to write down. I just like giving you background information on the people that you're learning about. He grew up with 9 brothers and sisters, and John Wilkes Booth was actually a very famous actor. In fact, he was the lead in some of William Shakespeare's most famous plays. This individual, Mr. Booth, was an extremely popular actor in his time. This would be about like an actor like a Denzel Washington or maybe a Matt Damon. Someone of that amount of fame is who John Wilkes Booth was back during the time period of the Civil War. So the fact that he's the one who assassinates Abraham Lincoln, that would be like a famous actor nowadays assassinating our President of the United States, which is crazy to think about, that type of tie-in, that a famous person would do such a thing. John Wilkes Booth was a racist and Southern sympathizer during the war, so John Wilkes Booth himself was someone who was very much pro-slavery. He sided with the South, and obviously he hated Abraham Lincoln, who, as you probably have figured out, represented everything that John Wilkes Booth was against. Lincoln, supported the United States and supported the North and South being unified. John Wilkes Booth did not at all. Lincoln was against slavery. He was an abolitionist. John Wilkes Booth was a huge proponent of slavery. He thought that that was the way things should be and that that was the way that the Southern economy would make money. John Wilkes Booth blamed Lincoln for all the South's problems, and he really wanted revenge. And so it gives you a few of his motives here for why he chooses to assassinate President Lincoln. We'll get more into those details as we go through the PowerPoint. More about Booth. He started his acting career in 1855, and by 1860, when the Civil War began, he was making about $20,000 a year. Now, by today's standards, that would mean he's in poverty, but by 1850, 1860 standards, John Wilkes Booth was making a very good salary, making really nice money as an actor. So again, he was quite famous. In fact, some Americans called him the handsomest man in America, and he had an easy charm about him that attracted women. Now, if in the 1860s, if this guy right here was the handsomest man in America, oh boy, I don't know if that I can really say that that should be accurate, but that's evidently John Wilkes Booth was one of the most handsome men in America. Had an easy charm about him that attracted women. In 1859, just before the Civil War started, Booth was an eyewitness at the execution of John Brown, who you may remember was a big abolitionist. He actually stood near the area that John Brown was hung from, and so Booth himself got to see a death of a leading abolitionist, and he was fully supportive. John Wilkes Booth himself, he wanted to see abolitionists die. He wanted slavery to continue, so he was absolutely fine being at John Brown's hanging. November 9th, 1863, after the Battle of Gettysburg, over halfway through the war, President Lincoln actually watched John Wilkes Booth in the role of Raphael in The Marble Heart in Ford's Theater. Now, Ford's Theater is in Washington, D.C. This is actually going to be the location of Lincoln's assassination by Booth. And what's crazy is to think that less than 2 years after Lincoln watched Booth perform at Ford's Theater, Booth actually kills Lincoln at Ford's Theater. So it's really crazy to think that, these two men were in the exact same location where Booth would later assassinate Lincoln. If you're looking at this date and wonder why it might be familiar, this is shortly before Lincoln goes to Gettysburg to give the Gettysburg Address. So he actually watches John Wilkes Booth, and I probably thought he was a pretty good actor. Some more pictures of the quote-unquote handsomest man in America. John Wilkes Booth, you can see some of his acting pictures here. I don't know if I want to grow that kind of mustache, but evidently it worked for Mr. Booth. The conspirators. Most historians believe that John Wilkes Booth did not work on his own, and it is widely believed that the 6 people pictured here, along with others, contributed greatly to the assassination of President Lincoln. In fact, this was truly a conspiracy in the fact that the plan was not only to kill Abraham Lincoln, but it was really to go after the entire Union government. And as I share things with you, I think it might surprise some of you just how elaborate John Wilkes Booth's plan was. But just to give you the names of some of the other co-conspirators, and you can use this in your assignment if you'd like, for some of these individuals: George Azarat, Sam Arnold, David Harold, Lewis Powell, who's also sometimes referred to as Lewis Payne, Michael O'Laughlin, and John Surratt. So these are some of the individuals that helped John Wilkes Booth to pull off this assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Booth's original plan. In the late summer of 1864, and to put that in war perspective for you, this is when Grant's total war concept is really in full bloom. You have Sheridan and Sherman who are burning parts of the South. The South is really being literally destroyed, and Booth and the Southerners were starting to realize that this war probably wasn't going to be won by the Confederates. And so John Wilkes Booth began developing plans to actually kidnap Abraham Lincoln. What he wanted to do is take him to the Richmond, Virginia, which obviously is the Confederate capital, and hold him in return for prisoners of war. So Booth's idea was, well, this isn't going well for us, so if I kidnap the President of the United States, the Union will have no choice but to give us back prisoners of war and meet our demands, and if they don't, then maybe we'll kill Abraham Lincoln. So that was John Wilkes Booth's original plan. What happened was that Booth began meeting at a boarding house which was owned by a woman named Mary Surratt. Here's the picture of the boarding house here. And at this location, John Wilkes Booth met with his co-conspirators. On March 17, 1865, this is less than a month before the Civil War ends, the group planned to capture Abraham Lincoln, who was scheduled to attend a play at a hospital located on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. So there really was a plan to kidnap Lincoln. However, as often happens with the President of the United States, the President's plans changed, and Abraham Lincoln remained in the Capitol, so he never did actually go to this hospital to visit people. Therefore, Booth's plan to kidnap Lincoln failed. At least this first attempt failed. Big change in plans. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, Virginia, at Appomattox Courthouse, and as you're all well aware, the war is over. 2 days later, after the Civil War, so on April 11, 1865, it has now become public knowledge to people in Washington, D.C. that the war is over and Abraham Lincoln's giving this speech. 2 days later, April 11, 1865, Lincoln makes a speech on the front lawn of the White House to a large crowd gathered outside. John Wilkes Booth was actually in attendance to hear Lincoln's speech. One of the things that President Lincoln mentions in his speech is that he believes that voting rights should be granted to certain African Americans. Keep in mind that Lincoln has now freed all slaves in the Confederacy. The Confederates have lost, and so now Lincoln is building on this momentum and wants to give African Americans more rights. Now, as you might suspect, John Wilkes Booth was not very happy about that. John Wilkes Booth is a man who hates African Americans. He's a man who is very racist. And so he becomes infuriated, and now John Wilkes Booth's plan is not to just kidnap Abraham Lincoln. The plan now turns to, I'm going to kill Abraham Lincoln, is the thought process of John Wilkes Booth. All because Lincoln just mentioned giving voting rights to certain African Americans. In fact, what certain African Americans? Lincoln's quote here, on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. So basically, very intelligent African Americans and those that served for the Union Army, Abraham Lincoln thought should have the opportunity to vote. It's not like Lincoln was doing all sorts of different things, but Booth was enraged. Evidently, there's a quote somewhere that a historian has found that Booth said to someone, "Now by God, I'll put him through." That is the last speech he, meaning Abraham Lincoln, will ever make. And that actually ended up being the case. The speech that Lincoln gave 2 days after the Civil War was his last public speech that Abraham Lincoln ever gave to the United States. So what happens? Well, here's the opportunity. On April 14th, which, by the way, just happened to be Good Friday of Easter weekend. Kind of crazy to think about. Booth stopped at Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. while John Wilkes Booth was at Ford's Theater, he learned that the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, had plans to attend the April 14th, Friday the 14th, Easter, Good Friday weekend. Lincoln himself had plans to attend the evening performance of the play Our American Cousin. So John Wilkes Booth now realizes Abraham Lincoln, this man that I despise, is now going to be at the place that I work, in the place that I have pretty good access to. So this kind of becomes Booth's opportunity to kill Lincoln. Booth meets with his conspirators one final time, and Booth started to give the orders. Booth said that he himself would be the one to kill the President of the United States at Ford's Theater that evening on April 14th. Booth gave the others their orders, and he arranged for a very fast horse to be waiting for him. Now, if you watch a lot of movies, you probably often see getaway cars that the bad guys use to get away from whatever it is that they're doing. If they're robbing a bank or, committing a crime or whatever. Well, in 1865, there was no such thing as a getaway car. So the handsomest man in America, John Wilkes Booth, had a fast getaway horse. And that is how he was able to leave Ford's Theater. More on that in a little bit. Here were the plans that here were the plans that Booth had for the other conspirators. Lincoln's vice president of the United States was a man named Andrew Johnson. George Azarat, who was one of the conspirators along with Booth, was supposed to, quote-unquote, take care of Andrew Johnson. Azarat's plan, and as part of this entire conspiracy, was to kill the Vice President of the United States, Johnson, at the Kirkwood House, which is where Johnson lived. This location you can see in this artist depiction here. George Azarat did not actually kill Andrew Johnson. The story historically differs as to why. Most historians and things that I've read say that George Azarat simply chickens out after having too many drinks. To put that in another way, George Azarat goes to the Kirkwood House, goes to the bar. Obviously, he's a little nervous about trying to kill the Vice President of the United States, so he starts having drinks and keeps drinking and drinking and drinking. And he never actually makes an attempt on Andrew Johnson's life. Some things that I've read say that he basically shot his mouth off to the bartender after he'd had too much to drink and mentioned that he might have been trying to kill Andrew Johnson. Other people say that he just got so intoxicated that he never actually did anything to the vice president. Regardless, Andrew Johnson, the vice president of the United States, never actually had an assassination attempt on him. At least not on this occasion. William Seward. William Seward is the man pictured here, and he was the Secretary of State for Abraham Lincoln. So he was basically Abraham Lincoln's highest-ranking cabinet member. David Harold, pictured here, and Lewis Powell, or Lewis Payne, depending how you say his name. Different historians have different last names for him. Their job was to kill William Seward, the Secretary of State. These two men invade Seward's home and wildly attempt to stab him. Now, they do make some marks, so to speak, on the Secretary of State, William Seward, but they do not actually strike any fatal blows. So David Harold, Lewis Powell sneak into or break into William Seward's home. They try to kill him with knives. Seward is able to escape. His family is able to fend off the two attackers. And so the Secretary of State, although they try to kill him, he does not pass away from their attacks. So William Seward does survive the assassination attempt. The overall goal, and here's where this gets really crazy. John Wilkes Booth wanted to have all these attacks take place simultaneously at about 10:15 on the evening of Friday, April 14th. So again, for your assignment here, you're looking at Friday, April 14th, 10:15. That's when all this was supposed to go down. Now you might say, why would John Wilkes Booth want to kill at the same time the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State, William Seward? Well, Booth really hoped that the resulting chaos would result in a major weakness in the Union government, and it would lead to an opportunity for the Confederates, the South, to make a comeback. And as crazy as this plan was, it does make sense. If you take out 3 of the highest ranking members of the national government all on the same night in the same area at the same time, the Union's going to be scrambling, and it's going to be a pretty difficult situation. The location of Lincoln's assassination was Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. This is where Lincoln is shot. Again, the crazy thing, Booth had actually performed there twice before. Once, when Lincoln watched him in 1863 in November, and the most recent time prior to him assassinating Lincoln was on March 18, 1865. So basically, less than a month before he kills Lincoln, he actually performs on stage at Ford's Theater. Now, I've never actually been to Ford's Theater, though I would really like to go at some point in my life. But I have had students who have went there, and they say that you are able to tour Ford's Theater, though Abraham Lincoln, the actual box where he was killed, you're no longer able to get up there. So you can see it, but you don't actually get a tour of the place where Lincoln was shot. Lincoln's evening. Give you an idea of what happens here. President Lincoln and his wife arrive. Again, this is Friday, April 14th. They arrive at 8:30 p.m. with their guests, Major General Henry Rathbone, a Union general, and Major Rathbone's girlfriend, a woman named Clara Harris. So you have Abraham Lincoln, his wife Mary Todd Lincoln, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's girlfriend, Miss Harris. So the 4 of them are seated in the state box, which you see here. And actually, when Lincoln went in, which is customary anytime a president enters a room, they played Hail to the Chief. So the people in the theater were well aware that Abraham Lincoln was there that night. Lincoln's regular bodyguard was a man named Ward Lamon. He happened to be that night away on personal business. So a new security guard, a new bodyguard, the basically Secret Service of the 1860s, was assigned and was posted outside of Lincoln's door. Now you might be thinking to yourself, oh boy, this doesn't sound good. And you're right. The fact that Lincoln's bodyguard was away definitely leads to what's about to happen next. Lincoln's protection, and I use the word protection very loosely because this was probably the worst protection any person, any security guard has ever given to any public figure. You're going to want to know the name, and I put it in red for you, John Parker. John Parker was a Washington, D.C. police officer who'd been assigned as Lincoln's bodyguard for the evening of April 14th. He met Lincoln just as he was entering the state box. Now, any of us with a brain in our head would think, wow, I have the job for the evening of guarding the President of the United States. Not just any President of the United States, but the President who leads us out of the Civil War. And this is his first Friday night to be able to celebrate the Union victory and actually get an opportunity to relax with his wife, with his guests. You would think that John Parker would take that job seriously. Not so much. John Parker, who did not have a very good record as a police officer, took his seat outside the box. Now, this is what just boggles my mind. Why would you hire someone who's incompetent, someone who doesn't do very good with his job, to guard the President of the United States? I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever know. Here's where the story really gets interesting, and it shows what's able to happen to Lincoln. John Parker found that he could not actually see the stage from where he was sitting, so he left his post outside of Abraham Lincoln's door to find a better seat. Now, I know you're thinking, what? This guy who's in charge of guarding the President of the United States leaves his seat because he can't see the play? It doesn't matter if he can see the play. You're right, it doesn't. Parker leaves. I don't know. Got me. Unbelievably, John Parker, then at intermission, basically the halftime of this theater production, leaves the theater with Lincoln's footman and his coachman, basically the people who brought Lincoln there. The 3 of them go to the bar next to the theater for a drink. Yes, that's right. The man who's in charge of guarding the President of the United States leaves his post, leaves the theater. Where does he go? A bar to drink. Makes no sense. If you're curious, Parker remained a police officer for Washington, D.C. until 1868 when he was fired on the job for sleeping. Parker was not fired even though he was the one in charge of protecting Lincoln on the night of his assassination. How dumb is this? Parker wasn't fired for letting the President of the United States get killed. That was his warning, so to speak, and then he gets fired 3 years later for sleeping on the job. Talk about someone who was really, really bad at their job. John Parker, just saying. So John Wilkes Booth arrives at Ford's Theater in the vicinity of around 9:30 again on April 14th, Friday night, 1865, 5 days after the Civil War ends. Historians tell us that Booth also goes to a tavern next to the theater. Could it have been the same one that John Parker went to? Possible. If I was making a movie, that's definitely how it would go. And evidently, Booth asked the bartender for a bottle of whiskey and some water. Another customer said to Booth, whose father was also an actor, John Wilkes Booth's dad also acted. The customer said to Booth, "You'll never be the actor that your father was." John Wilkes Booth replied to him, "When I leave the stage, I will be the most famous man in America." And that quote ended up being very true. Now, he wasn't the most famous man in America because of the fact that he was an actor, but because of what he does on stage for the last time in his life, coming up right now. John Wilkes Booth enters Ford's Theater at about 10:07 p.m., April 14th, Friday night, 1865. Booth could see the white door he needed to be able to get into Lincoln's state box. Charles Forbes, who's the man also guarding Abraham Lincoln, he was Lincoln's footman, was seated next to the door, and the Booth apparently handed him a card. Now, if you're Charles Forbes, you're probably thinking, well, I'm one line of defense between the President of the United States, but I've got John Parker also behind me, and he's guarding another door. So it'll probably be okay if I just let this John Wilkes Booth guy, again, this famous actor, who's known fairly well throughout the United States, if I let him back there, he probably needs to get his mail, or probably needs to pick up a script, or he probably just needs to get backstage. It just kind of makes sense. So Forbes lets him into the area, and Booth now has nothing between himself and Abraham Lincoln. Maybe the card said he needed his mail. Maybe it said he needed his script. Maybe, John Wilkes Booth, just said, "Hey, I have permission to be here. I work here." In any event, if you're Forbes, you could believe that. Quietly, John Wilkes Booth opened the door and entered the dark area in the back of Lincoln's box, where Lincoln, his wife, and his two guests were seated. John Wilkes Booth propped the door shut with the wooden leg of a music stand, which he had placed there on one of his earlier visits during the day. Again, John Wilkes Booth had a pretty good idea of where Abraham Lincoln was going to be, and he shut the door behind him to make sure that no one would be able to get in after he assassinates Lincoln. The moment of truth. John Wilkes Booth had seen the play Our American Cousin before, and as he snuck up on President Lincoln, he actually waited for a moment that he knew the audience would be laughing. And what he did, as you can see in this depiction, he sneaks up behind Abraham Lincoln's head, near his left ear, with this Derringer pistol, and pulls the trigger. Gives you another artist's depiction of what might have happened here. You can see Lincoln, his wife Mary Todd Lincoln, and his two guests. Obviously, John Wilkes Booth here, you can see how he snuck up on him. What Booth then does, as soon as he shoots Lincoln, Henry Rathbone, again, the man that Lincoln was sitting next to, one of his guests, one of these Union generals, he gets up and he starts wrestling with John Wilkes Booth. I mean, it's pretty clear that Booth just shot the President of the United States. It's clear that Rathbone is going to try to stop him. And Booth pulls out his knife, this switchblade right here, and stabs Rathbone in the left arm. Now, Rathbone was wounded, but he did end up surviving this. But Booth had the idea, as you can see here, after he shot Lincoln, he has this knife in the other hand to defend himself and to go even further. You can see Clara Harris, and obviously Mary Todd Lincoln watches her husband get shot right in front of her. Sic semper tyrannis. John Wilkes Booth yells as he shoots Lincoln. Sic semper tyrannis, by the way, is a Latin phrase which means as always to tyrants. To put that in 8th grade friendly language for you, the bad guys win, or the bad guys prevail. Booth jumps 11 feet to the stage below. To give you an idea, 11 feet is actually taller than the ceiling in this room. As John Wilkes Booth hit the floor, he snapped the fibula bone in his left leg just above the ankle. If you've ever heard the old play saying or the old musical saying, "Don't break a leg," this is where it comes from. John Wilkes Booth literally broke his leg on his 11-foot jump to the stage. As you can imagine, though, 11 feet jump, quite a lot. If you've ever jumped out of the back of a pickup truck and it kind of hurts your legs before, well, the pickup truck isn't exactly 11 feet in the air. Booth flashes his knife at the audience, and he made his way across the stage in front of more than 1,000 people. Everything happened so fast that no one had time to stop him. Some audience members actually thought that this was part of the show, and they really didn't know what to think. Imagine being there yourself, enjoying a date at the theater, and all of a sudden you've seen the President of the United States get shot and a Major General be stabbed, and it's by this famous actor who appears to have broken his leg. I mean, the whole scene had to be something just unbelievable if you were a patron, a person watching Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Gives the idea of Booth as he escapes across stage. Remember, he said when he left the stage he'd be the most famous man in America, and indeed he was for what he did to Abraham Lincoln. As I mentioned earlier, John Wilkes Booth arranged for a very fast horse to be there. Booth went out the back door, climbed on his horse, and escaped from the city of Washington, D.C. by the Navy Yard Bridge. Again, this all happens shortly after 10 o'clock, probably at around 10:15 in the evening on Friday, April 14th, 1865. Booth met up with one of his conspirators, Herod, and they headed for Lloyd's Tavern that was leased from Mary Surratt. Again, Mary Surratt helped these guys to be able to do an awful lot of things. This gives you a timeline, and this might be a really good slide for you to take a look at as you get to writing. This is slide number 26, so it might be easier for you to look at it there. But it gives you an idea of the path that John Wilkes Booth took after he assassinated Lincoln. And it literally gives you, he goes to a tavern, he then goes to the home of Dr. Mudd, more on that in a little bit, and then he basically just hides from the United States Army until he gets to Garrett's farm, which we'll go around that here and talk about that in just a few moments. You can see he rides, literally, 40, 50 miles from D.C. as a way to try to escape. About 4 a.m. on April 15th, 1865, so this is now early Saturday morning, Dr. Mudd, who is a doctor, as you might have guessed, and Harold, one of Booth's accomplices, arrive at Dr. Mudd's home, and Mudd basically sets and splints John Wilkes Booth's broken leg. Now, some people say that Mudd knew that he was helping the man who assassinated Lincoln. Other people say, he just saw this famous guy stop by and, set his broken leg to help him out. Back in Washington, D.C., after he examined Lincoln's head wound, the Army surgeon that was first on scene, a man named Charles Leal, warned that the president would not survive a carriage ride back to the White House. So, to get Abraham Lincoln out of Ford's Theater, they carried him across the street to 10th Street to the home of a German merchant tailor named William Peterson. Imagine being William Peterson, minding your own business in downtown D.C. The next thing you know, these basically Secret Service agents and Army personnel are knocking on your door, and there is Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, with a gunshot wound in the back of his head, and they're asking him if they can take him into your house. Yeah, you can, but talk about a crazy Friday night for the Petersons. Here's your sad news here. Dr. Robert King Stone, which was Lincoln's family doctor, arrived around 11 o'clock p.m. So he arrives a little less than an hour after Abraham Lincoln was shot, but there was little that anyone could do. Many doctors present knew that the president would not recover. In fact, a lot of historical documents say that the doctors actually made things worse as they were trying to get the bullet out, and they actually pushed it deeper in and did further damage to Abraham Lincoln. And because of that, he never again regained consciousness, and he actually dies on at 7:22 a.m. on Good Friday, April 15th, 1865. So I guess I was incorrect. Lincoln, it was the Thursday was the 14th, and so he dies. He actually passes on the next day, which is Good Friday, April 15th, 1865. So Lincoln's shot on the Thursday, and he dies on the Friday at 7:22 a.m. So 7:22, Good Friday, April 15th, 1865. That's probably one of those dates that you can definitely use with your tweets. Again, if you've already written down April 14th, again, my apologies, that is a Thursday. Gives you an artist's depiction of Abraham Lincoln at the Peterson's home. This is an artist's depiction of Andrew Johnson, the vice president. You can imagine what's going through his mind, thinking, oh my goodness, I now have to replace Abraham Lincoln. You can see Lincoln's wife there, Mary Todd Lincoln, mourning over her husband. And obviously this is going to lead us to probably the biggest manhunt in the history of the United States. The morning of Lincoln's death on April 15th, 1865, over 2,000 Union soldiers rode out of Washington, D.C., pursuing John Wilkes Booth. 2,000 soldiers after one man. 11 days later, on April 26th, 1865, the soldiers and detectives tracked down John Wilkes Booth on Garrett's farm near Port Royal, Virginia. Orders were to bring John Wilkes Booth home alive. So the idea here was they wanted John Wilkes Booth to be found, they wanted to get him, and they wanted to bring him in alive. Now notice I just said bring him in alive, and then this next title is Booth Killed. Yeah, that's right. April 26th, the lieutenant in charge at Garrett Farm decided to ignite the barn that Booth was holding up in, hoping to force him out. As deputies and Army personnel learned where Booth was, he was basically hiding in a barn, and they knew he had a broken leg, and so they thought that setting the barn on fire would basically force John Wilkes Booth to step out, which he did. Sergeant Boston Corbett, this man pictured right here, shoots at Booth, hitting him in the back of the head, and Booth dies just over 2 hours later. Now, Boston Corbett went against orders. They were told to bring John Wilkes Booth in alive. And he purposefully, Corbett, shoots John Wilkes Booth in the back of the head. So Corbett disobeys orders. Was he punished? No. Not at all. And some of you might be going, I don't really blame people for doing that. If this is something you're including in your tweets, again, this happens on April 26th, 1865, when Corbett shoots and kills John Wilkes Booth. If you're curious, Corbett did eventually go a little bit crazy afterwards, but he was never actually punished by the military. It gives you an idea of what might have happened here. John Wilkes Booth, obviously this barn is on fire. He's looking to step out here. The trial of the conspirators. The government charges 8 people with conspiracy. Again, it wasn't just John Wilkes Booth that was involved in this entire thing. On May 1st, 1865, President Andrew Johnson ordered the formation of a military commission to try the accused persons. The actual trial began on May 10th and lasted until June 30th. Again, all of this in 1865. Gives you an idea what the commission may have looked like at their meetings. Lewis Powell, this man was charged with conspiracy in the attempted assassination of Secretary of State William Seward. Powell, of course, entered Seward's home on April 14th, 1865, and tried stabbing to death the Secretary of State. Powell knifed and pistol-whipped 5 people in the house. Luckily, none of them were killed. Powell was found guilty, and he was sentenced to hang on July 7th, 1865, and that actually happened. So yet again, another date, if you want to include Lewis Powell's, the day that he was executed. David Harold, he was also charged with conspiracy, guiding Powell to Seward's home and assisting Booth during John Wilkes Booth's 12 days on the run after he shot Lincoln. When Booth and Harold were surrounded in a barn at Garrett's farm, Harold gave up. So this man was actually at Garrett's farm when John Wilkes Booth was killed. Harold steps out of the barn. He gives up, but he was obviously found guilty, and he was hung as well on July 7th, 1865. George Azeroth, again, the man who was supposed to kill the Vice President of the United States and never actually did. Azeroth rented a room at the Kirkwood House and directed a series of what they say is suspicious questions to the hotel's bartender. Even though Azeroth made no actual attempt to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, he was found guilty of conspiracy, and he was hung on July 7th, 1865. So this guy, it was found out that he knew what was going on, and so he was killed just because he knew what was happening. Mary Surratt. Remember, she owned the boarding house where Booth and his conspirators met. And a lot of people say she kept the nest that hatched the egg. In other words, she may not have been directly involved in all the things going on, but she clearly knew what was happening, and she was running errands for Booth kind of behind the scene that facilitated his escape. It was alleged that John Wilkes Booth used her boarding house to meet with his co-conspirators. Surratt was found guilty, and she, too, was hung on July 7, 1865. This gives you a visual depiction of the 4 individuals that were sentenced to hang. And this next picture is a little bit graphic in a sense, just because it's going to show their dead bodies, but I show it to you just to give you an idea of historically what did happen on July 7th, 1865. And here you can see the execution. You can see the Union soldiers here along the perimeter, basically watching all this happen. And this was done in public to show people, hey, if you're going to kill the President of the United States and have this massive conspiracy, here's what's going to happen to you. Samuel Mudd, remember, he is the doctor who helps John Wilkes Booth after he was broken his leg. Mudd was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. However, Lincoln's replacement, Andrew Johnson, actually pardons Dr. Mudd, meaning he sets him free. If you remember, that's one of those powers of the executive branch. They can pardon anyone they wish, meaning they can let anyone out of jail. And Andrew Johnson does this in February of 1869. Sam Arnold. Arnold was charged with being part of Booth's earlier plot to kidnap the President of the United States. He was sentenced and he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Sam Arnold, like Dr. Mudd, was pardoned by Andrew Johnson, and he lived until 1906. So here's probably one of the last ties to the Lincoln assassination in terms of how long he was able to live. Michael O'Laughlin. Like Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin was charged with a conspiracy to kidnap, not kill, but kidnap the president. Found guilty, sentenced to life. He dies in prison in 1867. Most people believe that he, too, probably would have been pardoned, being let go by Andrew Johnson. Ned Spangler, charged with helping Booth escape from Ford's Theater immediately after the assassination. In other words, this guy was in charge of the getaway horse. Found guilty, sentenced to 6 years in prison. He, too, was pardoned by Andrew Johnson after only 4 years. Now, you may be wondering, why did Andrew Johnson, the President of the United States, the man who was Lincoln's vice president, why would he pardon all of these people? Why would he allow them to get out of jail? And that's just one of those mysteries of history. We don't really know why Andrew Johnson chose to do that. And there were a lot of people then, and there are a lot of people now who didn't like what Johnson chose to do. Lincoln's funeral procession, you can see this artist work of what it may have looked like with Lincoln's body in the casket in the White House. Lincoln's funeral procession left Washington, D.C. on April 21st, 1865, so Lincoln's body actually left D.C. before they actually found John Wilkes Booth. 6 days later, they basically had this huge funeral march down the streets of D.C. Lincoln's body is going to be buried in Springfield, Illinois, what many people consider to be Abraham Lincoln's hometown. And his body actually made the 1,654-mile journey back, which was the same way that Lincoln traveled on his way in as president. And they actually traveled him on railroads, because railroads obviously were a big thing in the North at that point in time. Gives you an idea of what the streets of D.C. may have looked like to pay their respects to President Lincoln. You can see the streets just lined with people. Again, Abraham Lincoln was such a beloved figure in the Union. Lincoln's body was carried by train in a grand funeral procession through several states all the way back to Illinois. Lincoln is buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, where there's a 177-foot-tall granite tomb surmounted with several bronze statues of Lincoln. This is where Abraham Lincoln's buried. And you might look at this and go, my goodness, Mr. Basin, that is one heck of a memorial. And it is. But for maybe the most famous man ever in the history of the United States, you can understand why it's such a big deal. His body, I've never been here, but my father-in-law has, and he says that Lincoln's body, I believe, is located in this area. But look at the massive, structure here with the tomb, and then obviously all the statues here to honor the former president. And here's the way that Lincoln takes back via the railroads, and you can see where Springfield, Illinois, located right about in the middle of the state. And that's going to be it for your Lincoln Assassination PowerPoint. Again, I would really make sure that you're taking a look at different things at the directions as you go ahead and start this assignment. But remember, really make sure you're putting in the date and time of the tweet. That's one of the things I'm looking at. Also, give this website, lettercount.com, a look, and it will count all your characters to make sure you're at or below 140. If you have questions, feel free to ask them. And remember, this assignment's due tomorrow, and I'll give you the rest of the time today and basically all day tomorrow to work on it. So, good luck.